In this video, I will introduce the basics of independent sample t-tests. We use independent samples t-tests when we want to compare the mean value of a variable between two groups in our sample. For example, we might want to compare the mean age between two groups. This figure shows group 1 and group 2's distributions and means for the variable age. If we just look at the figure, we might say that the mean for group 2 in our sample is greater than the mean for group 1 in our sample, and we would be right. But remember that the whole point of collecting data and calculating statistics from samples is to learn about parameters from the underlying population. And whenever we take a sample of our population, we're only estimating the underlying population's parameters. In other words, there's always error in our estimates. So what we are interested in knowing is whether or not our sample has given us strong enough evidence to say that the two means are different from each other. We start with the null hypothesis that there is no difference between the means. Then we are going to calculate the probability that this null hypothesis is true in the underlying population. We do this by calculating something called the t-statistic. The t-statistic is calculated by dividing the difference in means between our two groups by the standard error of this difference. The greater the t-statistic, the less chance there is that the null hypothesis is true. This t-statistic is called a test statistic because it's what we use to test our null hypothesis. Let's take a closer look at the formula. The numerator is the difference between means in our sample. As this difference gets larger, the more confidence we have that there's a real difference between the means and our underlying population. For example, this figure shows the means of the distributions for the two groups in our sample. We would have more confidence that our sample differences are real if the means were even further apart, and less confidence that our sample difference is real if the means are closer together. The denominator of the formula is the standard error of the differences between the sample means. This is calculated with the formula shown here where V is the group's variance. This part of the formula is saying that as the spread of our data around the means increases, so does the size of our denominator. And as our denominator gets bigger, our t-statistic gets smaller. In other words, the more our data are spread out around our sample means, the less confident we are that the underlying population means are different from each other. Let's look at this visually. This is what we said our distributions for age looked like. If instead they looked like this with a lot of overlap between the two distributions, we would be less confident that the means are actually different from each other in the underlying population. If they looked like this, we would be more confident that the means are actually different from each other in the underlying population. So just to summarize, what this formula tells us is that the more distance there is between the means of the two groups in our sample, the more confident we are that the underlying means differ from each other in the population. And the less the distributions are spread out around the means in our sample, the more confident we are that groups are different from each other in the underlying population. Once we've calculated our t-statistic, we can then consult what is called a t-table. T-tables can easily be found on the internet. If we know our t-statistic and our degrees of freedom, which is the combined sample size of our two groups minus 2, the t-table will tell us our p-value for the null hypothesis. For example, if we were comparing the mean age between two groups with 40 degrees of freedom and a t-statistic of 2.7, the probability our null hypothesis is true would be 0.005. In other words, our data would be telling us that there's a 0.5% chance that there is no difference between means in the other underlying population. With an alpha of 0.05 or 5%, we would reject the null hypothesis and say we have sufficient evidence that the mean ages of our two groups are different from each other in the underlying population. Luckily, nowadays we have computers that do all of this computation for us, and statisticians rarely calculate t-statistics by hand or use t-tables to test their null hypothesis. It's important to note that a t-test is not always correct to use in every situation. The accuracy of the t-test results are based on a few important underlying assumptions. The first is that our variable is continuous. In the example, we used age, which is usually a continuous variable. T-tests are not meant for categorical variables. The second is that our variable is normally distributed. The further the distribution is from normal, the less valid the t-test will be. The third is that the variances or standard deviations of the distributions for our two groups are roughly equal to each other. A t-test would be less valid if the distributions look something like this with unequal variances.